I'm someone who believes in journalism. For me, journalism is about the fact that the world is never as I imagine it to be. And the story starts where my preconception ends. One of the stories which was sort of critical to my development was in 1985. And I did a law degree at university and I finished in 1975 just as John Kerr sacked Whitlam and Garfield Barwick was involved, and it was part of the reason I didn't go on with law. And of course, I had a very low opinion of Malcolm Fraser. In 1985, The Age sent me to interview Malcolm Fraser for a series they were doing on work. And I go to meet him. He has no interest whatsoever in talking about what The Age wants to talk to him about. But he's just been to South Africa and he's been in a prison and he's met a black man called Nelson Mandela who he thinks can avert civil war in South Africa. And I was the only journalist who talked to him. So that was an example of me going with a preconception and then the reality was something else altogether. In Melbourne, I got asked quite a lot to speak in schools about journalism. I used to say to kids, just because most journalism is trash, just because most of it is cheap and cynical, you must never think that good journalism doesn't matter. Good journalism is like clean air. Journalists are a funny lot. They include some of the most shallow and most cynical people you'll ever meet. But it also includes true believers and crusaders. Every year around the world, around 70 journalists are killed and murdered. And there are currently more than 500 journalists in prison around the world. They are people who've got too close to stories which threaten powerful interests, but they keep doing it. We're talking today about Andrew Bent. If I have a hero as a journalist, it's Henry Melville, author of A History of Van Diemen's Land, 1824 to 36, which he wrote from the condemned cell at Hobart Prison where the regime of Governor Arthur had put him. It's a fantastic book. He was completely over what was going on down here, the corruption in the land grants, the involvement of Arthur and his family in it, the matter of trying Aboriginal people in court cases where they didn't have the language to understand the proceedings, the legal difficulties which have been recognised in New South Wales about hanging people after you've occupied a land on the basis of terra nullius. He was across all this stuff. So what Henry Melville persuades me and the example of journalists around the world, the good news is that there are always going to be people who are compelled to get the truth out. The bad news is that we're living through a period where the journalistic forms are all under enormous pressure and in periods of rapid change. And it's not just the ABC and the BBC that are in crisis. I think journalism itself is in a crisis. And the fact that in the recent elections, mainstream journalism has consistently got big things wrong. And for me, the fact that Scott Morrison, who was a charlatan, slipped through without ever being realistically assessed or examined. The ABC is not perfect. I mean, my colleagues up here today will know more, able to give you a more informed opinion on it, but it seems to be not as good as what it was. In 2021, I had a big run-in with the ABC over a story they published about Tom Wills, a character in the history of Australian sport who I've written about. That's a continuing difference. But I still support the ABC. I support the ABC because in the course of my adult lifetime, they have done so much good work. There have been so many examples of it. The ABC does things commercial networks won't do and will never do. And you can argue endlessly about the theoretical basis of journalism. And it's an argument that goes nowhere. But most people sense when they're in the vicinity of good journalism. And the ABC is Australia's most trusted news organisation. That means something. But I also think the ABC has very powerful enemies. The IPA, which is basically a feeder club for the Liberal Party, is committed to its privatisation. And the Murdochs are enraged at the very existence of the ABC, which they oppose on ideological grounds, but also because the ABC occupies a huge market, as with the BBC, that Murdoch would like to get into. I lived through a lot of change at Fairfax. I was there 32 years. And one of the really critical periods was after Conrad Black took over in the early 90s. And I saw a lot of what went on then. Media organisations are very easy to subvert. They are very easy to muzzle. They are very easy to rob of their enthusiasm and their desire and their hunger to get out and do the job. You can do it through board appointments, you can do it through CEO appointments, but possibly the most important thing is when they unnerve middle management. Because invariably in media organisations, it's middle management who define the tone and the ambit of the journalistic inquiry, as well as maybe saying we're looking that way and not that way. Because journalism is inherently imperfect, but the fact of the matter is some people do it better than others and some places do it better than others. So I think the battle is on, both here and in Britain, to save the ABC and the BBC. I can only quote Winston Churchill, the cost of freedom is eternal vigilance. And, you know, what am I doing about it? My wife runs Friends of the ABC in northern Tasmania, my wife Polly. When push came to shove there during the last federal election, there weren't many people on the ground and we did a lot of driving around putting up posters. But I think we all have to do what we can and we've got to make the case for good journalism. I think the most important people are kids, getting into schools and trying to explain to kids that journalism, however trashy and disreputable it may appear, there are still great journalists. And I'm talking about people like Marie Colvin, but there are many of them. And that what they do is part of the lifeblood of our societies and our democracies.